and they cast shadows on the ground. Here's some more examples. Here in a very frosty area, here in a more temperate latitude. We see lots of structure that's reminiscent to vegetation tending to cluster and get denser in places. The next picture is Arthur C. Clarke's favorite, famous science fiction author. He calls these the Martian trees. We see that there's a central area like a trunk with branching at several levels going out from there radially, and we see shadows cast on the ground. This one would be about 100 meters across, but in the low gravity field of Mars, that isn't as remarkable as it might seem. It must be at least 50 meters high, judging from the height of the shadows. And there's its smaller twin. Here are some of Arthur Clarke's words for attribution. He says, "The recent discovery of life in the most improbable places, especially far down inside the Earth's crust, has now convinced me that we have been equally short-sighted. Some of the amazing images from the Mars Global Surveyor, especially the one we just saw, make me 95% sure that there are extensive areas of vegetation or its equivalent on Mars." Now we come to a different kind of feature, and before we go into this, I want to address the issue of natural versus artificial features on Mars and how a scientist tells the difference. And certainly by far the most famous example of an anomaly on Mars where artificiality has been proposed is the so-called face on Mars seen here in this image. This is in a region of Mars called Cydonia, and over here we see some vaguely pyramidal-shaped objects with lots of little mound shapes in the middle. We see other things. Just off the bottom of the image is something called the D&M Pyramid. I'll have a picture of that again later. There's another mesa here. This whole area has a number of anomalies. This feature with what looks like a triangular area in its interior has been dubbed the fortress. The names are more names to remember features by than they are intended to be suggestions of what they really are. But that one I'll mention again in a moment. And this is the famous face. Now, when this was first seen in 1976, a lot of people laughed and said, "Ho, ho, interesting geological feature. It looks like a face," and some people will probably take it literally, but we've always got nuts in society. There are many people who said that and started talking about face loonies. But there were other people, including some serious scientists, such as the astronomers who first presented this to the American Astronomical Society in 1981, DePietro and Molinar, who said, there's a little too much here to dismiss this as an accident. It could be an accident of geology, but there's enough here that we shouldn't miss the possibility that this just might be something significant. And between them and a group of 30 independent scientists known as the Society for Planetary SETI Research, SPSR, Society for Planetary SETI Research, the scientists set up tests that could be used to determine from future findings whether this thing was natural or artificial. One obvious one is visible right here. We only see half a face. If this was intended to be a humanoid face and not an accident of nature, the other half should look more or less symmetric. It should complete the image. If this was an accident of nature, this would be mountains, valleys, craters, plains, anything but another half of a face. But there were 8 tests in all devised, and by the time I came on the scene, 5 of those tests had been passed, and later a 6th was passed. But I had proposed 2 tests to determine whether this was natural or artificial. And when I say passed, The other 6 tests were then indicating that this was an artificial object, not a natural one. I proposed 2 tests, and they were coming out with the opposite conclusion. I said, since this can't be seen from the ground as a face, it must have been, if it were an artificial object, it must have been intended to be seen from above, in which case you're talking about people on the home planet or people on an orbiting space station, beings, I should say, but clearly to be seen from above, and in that case you would wanted to build it on the equator so that it could be seen that way. And this object is far from the equator of Mars at 42 degrees north latitude. Moreover, if it was intended to be seen as a face, you wouldn't build it tipped over on its side or at some weird angle. You'd build it upright so that it would look like a face to any viewer looking down from above. And again, this is tipped at an angle of 35 degrees to vertical. Well, in an appearance on Art Bell's show with Richard Hoagland, we were talking about things related actually to the exploded planet hypothesis and origin of comets. And I mentioned the origin of Mars as a moon of planet V. And a listener wrote me an email and said, say, what about that face on Mars? Maybe that explosion, if that thing was built, maybe the explosion is what did in the builder's civilization. He said, and you mentioned a pole shift too that occurred at the same time. He said, well, tell me, where was the face on Mars before that pole shift? And I thought, well, that was an interesting question. As nearly as we can date that event, it was 3.2 million years ago. Where was the face on Mars before that all happened? So I got the coordinates out of the literature. Planetary geologist Peter Schultz, who has no connection with exploding planets or faces on Mars, had determined the previous position of the Martian pole before the major shift. And I got those coordinates, and I got the coordinates of this object, and using the coordinates of the pole, I drew in the old Martian equator. This object is within 1/10 of a degree of that line, even though the location of the equator is not as certain as 1/10 of a degree. So coincidence somewhat favors us, but the point is it's as close to the equator as we can tell from the accuracy of the data we have. And is it upright? You be the judge. It would look as though it was an upright face as seen from above. Well, here is a computer enhancement of the Viking image that was available after computer enhancement techniques were perfected in the mid-'80s. And we can see that while not a perfect mirror image, the mouth feature does go through, the nose feature does look as though it's at a higher elevation than the rest. There is another eye socket on the other side, and the enclosure is remarkably symmetric all the way around, the helmet-like feature as it's called. So the symmetry test was being passed also, and the 2 tests that I had proposed that indicated that it was a natural object because it wasn't built anyplace special and was built at an angle, were now suddenly shifting over into the artificial column as well, if we simply allowed for the fact that this might have been built before that cataclysm happened to Mars. So now we had all 8 tests that have been proposed by scientists coming out. This is an artificial object. Well, that's remarkable. Here are face-like objects seen here on Earth. Some are well-known, some less well-known. There are a great many of them. They have something in common. They are profile images or shadow images. They are either of this type, that they only look like a face when seen from one viewing angle, but if you go around front, you don't see anything that looks like a face at all. Same with this or this. This would be in the area of a trick of light and shadow. Any other time of day or viewing angle, you don't see it. Same thing down here with this. These are all two-dimensional face images, just as faces in clouds and faces in landscapes always are. As far as three-dimensional faces on this planet, the best example is these guys, Mount Rushmore. And their appearance as a face doesn't change when you view them at a different viewing angle. George Washington still looks like George.